Now, I've talked about norm referenced versus criterion referenced. I want to finish by talking about formative assessment versus summative. The norm criterion reference distinction is a technical distinction. The formative summative distinction is a distinction in purpose. And it's not unrelated to the distinction between norm and criterion reference. Summative assessment's what we do in all of the high stakes assessment. It's to provide a summary assessment of a student at a particular stage. Now, the status of those assessments can vary. Key stage assessment's pretty low stakes for individual students perhaps in this country, but it's high stakes for schools and potentially high stakes for teachers. A little less so if, as you are increasingly doing, you use value-added estimates and not just the raw performances. And other countries are doing that, using value-added estimates of what is it the school added, as opposed to what is it the student brought to school plus what the school added, all confounded together. And public examinations, of course, are high stakes. Formative assessment's intended to be low stakes. It's frequent, it's interactive assessment, it's designed to identify what the student knows now and needs to learn next. It's designed to help the teacher deal appropriately in moving the student to the next stage. The obvious barriers to widespread use of this in education systems are the tension that can occur between this kind of assessment and the high visibility summative assessments. If teachers think that the only thing that's going to count is where their students are on the high stakes assessment, they'll teach to those assessments. And they won't be driving an assessment practice that's designed simply to, in a more general way, advance the student's knowledge and understanding. It'll be more narrowly focused on the assessments. So that's one that has to be dealt with. And if there's a lack of connection between systemic school evaluation, and this fits directly with what was said before, if the practices to evaluate the system or the school are in conflict with good classroom formative assessment practice, then good classroom formative assessment practice will suffer. Now, Paul Black and Dylan William, both from here, of course, although Dylan William's now at Educational Testing Service in the US, in this review article of formative assessment, made some interesting claims. They offered that definition of what is formative assessment, but then observed a whole series of studies in which formative assessment practices were contrasted with more traditional assessment practices, and found that you could get effect sizes, these are mean differences, more than half a standard deviation, between 0.4 and 0.7 of a standard deviation, which are very large effect sizes, larger than one can get from most educational interventions. And that's their claim. This is about the most powerful thing we can do. Have an assessment system that informs instruction, and you'll get more benefits from instruction than almost any other thing you can do to change instruction, at least according to the research evidence today. And interestingly, many of the studies they reviewed showed that formative assessment actually helps the low achievers best, to the greatest extent. It makes explicit for them what the learning is. You see, I was going to say this later, I'll say it now. When I went to primary school in Australia, we were tested regularly by the teacher. And every time we got a new set of results, we were seated in new locations in the classroom. Back left was the current highest performer. Bottom right was the current lowest performer. You knew you'd got better if you'd moved. If you were down the bottom, sitting in the front right of the room, you had no idea what it was that would move you up. All the teacher told you every time was, you're still worse than those other people. Not, this is what you need to be able to do to perform at a higher level. But if you make the learning explicit and provide an assessment that's related to the learning, then the evidence, according to this systematic review of all of the research on this, is that it's those people who least understand what it is they're supposed to be learning who gain the greatest benefit. Now, it's not a guarantee. Denmark, actually, we've just published a report on formative assessment that you can find on our website, where we looked at some exemplary practices in a number of countries. Denmark is one that's got really interesting commitment to formative assessment. It's a legislative commitment to formative assessment. In the first PISA results, this was the distribution of performances of students in reading, the country's average performance on the vertical scale, and on the horizontal scale, how much money the country had spent by the time the students were 15 in educating them in equivalent US dollars, equivalent purchasing power parity US dollars, so that the metric for expenditure is common across countries. Now Denmark I've highlighted in a different colour. You can see it? Denmark is among the highest spenders, and it's only an average performer. Denmark looked at those results and said, good heavens, why are we getting so little given how much we spend? And in particular, look at Finland, in the centre and at the top. Finland, of course, a country that Denmark didn't like to discover was ahead of it, found not only was it well ahead of it in performance level, but it was spending a whole lot less. So the Danes came back and said, what I've just said, we've got average performance and high expenditure, we've got a pretty inefficient system. Other countries are doing better while spending less. So the Danes invited us to do an OECD review of their primary and lower secondary school system. And there's a full report on this, but the interesting conclusion was that this was a system that lacked a culture of accountability at all. There was a legislative requirement that teachers use formative assessment in the classroom, but absolutely nothing that gave the teacher any indication of whether what they were seeing was good in the overall scheme of things. Teachers do very well in assessing their own students in relation to one another and in relation to their own expectations. They often don't know whether their expectations are high or low compared with other people's expectations, or their students are doing well or poorly compared with other students. So armed with additional information, the Danes are now expecting that they'll see some movement in the direction of Finland. Mind you, Finland's not stationary. If you want to advance formative assessment, we argue in this report, and you can look in detail at it later, that these are the kinds of things in the countries, in the cases we looked at, that seem to be among the factors that facilitate the widespread adoption of formative assessment.